Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Geyn, and today we're discussing Mark Carney's Bill C-22. The government tells us that this legislation modernizes policing powers for the increasingly digital world. But civil liberties experts and the tech industry are sounding the alarm that this bill makes vague promises for increased safety at the cost of our privacy. At a very high level, Bill C-22 will require companies that provide electronic service to create technical capabilities to allow easy access to private data for law enforcement and CSIS. It will also allow the government to require companies to collect metadata like the location of your device and who it was communicating with for up to 1 year. And it will allow the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, in consultation with the Information Commissioner, to order secret spying on Canadians and may even allow the public safety minister to order companies to break encryption. The Public Safety Committee is currently studying the legislation, and it's possible that the government might make some changes. But right now, the bill appears to get the balance between privacy and security all wrong. Here today to discuss some of the concerns around C-22 are three experts who have already testified at committee: Professor Michael Geist from the University of Ottawa Law School, Alexander Surgenor, a civil liberties lawyer from the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and Matt Hatfield from OpenMedia. Thank you all for joining me today. I'll start with you, Professor Geist. At a very high level, I explained some of the concerns, but what actually is C-22 trying to achieve?
Well, I think you did a good job. It was definitely a mouthful to talk about all the different elements. And, this is a debate that's been going on really for decades now, as law enforcement has long argued that the tools they have to deal with criminal investigations, particularly ones that involve a digital component, which nowadays just about everyone will, are outdated or insufficient. Now, they've run into problems along the way. They've argued for some of these kinds of powers in the past. And repeatedly, the Supreme Court of Canada has struck them down. So we've had cases like the Spencer case and more recently the Bykovitz case that basically suggested that not only do Canadians have a reasonable expectation of privacy in this kind of information, but efforts to unpack that or unwind some of that and not provide sufficient privacy protections are unconstitutional. They don't meet our privacy standards. And I think fundamentally the concern, and I think you highlighted off the top, is whether or not this law strikes the right balance. No one's saying that there isn't room for addressing some of the concerns law enforcement has raised. But what we do see, I think, in this legislation is legislation that doesn't strike the right balance, that has significant implications, frankly, for companies to remain active and provide privacy protections to users, about the safeguards that I think most Canadians reasonably expect, and fundamentally a lack of evidence about where some of the problems lie. I don't doubt that there are issues, but we need a stronger case that demonstrates here's the problems they're facing and here are the solutions, minimally tailored to ensure that they do as much as possible to guard people's privacy.
Yeah, Matt, you said this pretty well at committee when the government MPs, members, were talking about police say they need more powers. You said, yeah, it would sure help police solve crimes if they had cameras in every Canadian's bedroom, but we don't advocate for that. I think that that's kind of the thing we need to highlight because this bill is very long, it's very technical. And for a lot of Canadians, they see language like electronic service provider, core provider, and they kind of, your eyes glaze over. What does all of this mean? So maybe you could articulate it at a practical level. What will it mean to give the government the tools they're asking for in C-22?
Well, it would mean a lot, but in terms of concerns around metadata, metadata is everything that isn't the actual literal contents of your messages. So the government is saying that they wouldn't force access to the text of your messages, to images you're sending, but everything else about your communications would be retained by these companies, available with a warranted request from law enforcement to be turned over for up to a year. So we're talking about your geolocation, every place that you've been. We're talking about who you've been messaging, for how long, at what times. And the nature of metadata is generally one point of data won't reveal a lot. But the more metadata you have, the more you can actually infer a huge amount about a person. It actually doesn't take that many data points to get quite a bit of information. And when we're talking about comprehensive metadata for a full year,
Hmm.
there's very little I think you wouldn't know about a person with that kind
Yeah.
of archive, which is
I
a
mean,
concern for use with warranted access and certainly with hackers as well.
absolutely. We've got to go to break now, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Bill C-22, which would expand police search powers in the digital era, and concerns that technology companies and civil libertarians and academics and activists all have, that this could put us in the direction of an era of mass surveillance. Now, Alexander, you testified at committee this recent week, and you raised a lot of concerns about C8 or C-22, in particular under Section 8 of the Charter, which protects Canadians from unreasonable search and seizure. Do you think that there is a risk here that this legislation could be used in a way that violates Section 8? And do you think if it's passed in its current form, might it face a constitutional challenge? Alexander?
That's right, Christine. Yes, Christine. Hi. I think you're bang on to have that concern. I do believe that it's almost inevitable that we will find ourselves in the not too distant future hearing about a case where, yes, a constitutional challenge is being made. And to be perfectly frank, any criminal defense lawyer worth his or her salt is going to investigate whether or not a charter challenge is an appropriate approach to take. I would certainly, it would depend, of course, on the circumstances, but I would be inclined to look into that, particularly because, as I said at committee, the net that the police are now hoping to cast is so wide. And as we know, and it might be frustrating to admit this, but it is the case, that we don't exactly know whether rights have been violated or not until a judge reaches that conclusion or doesn't. And so it has to find its way into the court. It has to then proceed in that manner. And only after the challenge is raised and a judge hears it will we know after the fact whether all of that data that was gathered, whether that was an unreasonable gathering or whether or not it can pass charter scrutiny. So I think it's inevitable, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if it comes to that very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly no use in giving police a new search power to obtain evidence that is then excluded because the search was an unreasonable one under the charter. So it wouldn't actually achieve the goal if the legislation is so flawed. And we know, as Professor Geist pointed out in the last segment, that there is case law from the Supreme Court that metadata can have a privacy interest, that we do have a reasonable expectation of privacy in some metadata. And that you gave the example of a recent Supreme Court case called Bykovets, which involved IP addresses. Now, a lot of people use VPNs to shield their IP addresses. Professor Geist, virtual private networks, VPNs, they've threatened to actually leave Canada if the legislation passes in its current form. Why are they threatening that, and what would the implications be?
Well, they've said that they can't really operate in Canada and comply with what this law envisions. And it's fairly straightforward. The VPNs at their heart do not log that kind of user data. I mean, it's core to the kind of service that they're offering. And so a service that does log user data, as would be required if you're moving into mandatory metadata retention, effectively the government stepping in saying you have to collect and retain this information for up to a year, just isn't a VPN service, or at least not a VPN service that we see widely available on a commercial basis. And so the response from VPNs that operate in Canada is that they simply can't comply and meet what they would see as their obligations or their core business case to users. And we've seen this play out in other jurisdictions. I think those that I might suggest, isn't this really just aren't they bluffing? Isn't this an idle threat? I don't think it is. I think we've seen this movie before elsewhere, and we know how it ends.
Yeah, we don't have news on Facebook or Instagram because the government thought it was a negotiating tactic. And it wasn't. So, Matt, very briefly, what would it mean for privacy if VPNs were to actually leave the market in Canada? What would that mean for Canadians who rely on them?
It would mean a much less secure and private internet. I mean, essentially, the businesses that are sounding the strongest warnings right now are those whose promise to their consumers is we protect your privacy first and foremost. It's the VPNs, it's Signal, it's Apple. All of the companies that have really said this is the most important value that we offer you as a consumer are saying we are leaving or we're in danger of cutting back what we offer if this passes. I think it would be a tremendous self-own on both an economic and security front for Canada to adopt this.
I mean, we have seen that this government is not afraid of a self-own, as we saw with the Online News Act, but I do hope that they back down on this because VPNs are such an important privacy tool for anyone dealing with secure information, from lawyers to activists to journalists to ordinary Canadians who care about this value. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the federal bill C-22, which includes a number of requirements that are put on electronic service providers and would give the police more search powers. And one of the objections to this legislation has been that it would require the creation of what the industry refers to as backdoors. So it would require companies that provide electronic services to create technical capabilities to allow access to private data for law enforcement. I think that is a concept that is hard for Canadians to maybe understand. It's a common understanding in industry, but Matt, maybe you could explain exactly what a backdoor is, what it would mean, and what the implications of requiring them are for Canadians' privacy on, for example, their Apple device.
So the government has tried to say that this legislation will not break encryption, and they're relying on a very narrow way of thinking about that. Encryption is the standard that means that most of your internet traffic is private. No one who isn't the intended recipient of what you're saying can access your communications. Now, the government is saying they won't literally break the code of encryption. They won't make it so that they can read those messages when they're in encrypted form. But functionally, they're creating what's called a backdoor. They want to be able to get at that data in another way, maybe not breaking the actual code, but seeing it before it's encrypted or otherwise accessing it at other stages of the journey. So in practice, for ordinary people's purposes, this does break your private communication.
Professor Geist, one of the other experts at committee was a representative for Apple. And they told the committee that they don't know how to create this, quote, backdoor so that only good guys can use it, so the police. If it exists, hackers will be able to infiltrate that. Do you think that that is a technical reality? Is that a legitimate concern, or is it just kind of, like a corporate talking point we might see from industry?
Oh, I think it's math. I think the reality is that once you weaken the protections that are there, you have no way of ensuring that it is limited exclusively to law enforcement. And we don't have to look far for this. I mean, the part of this whole debate that is so striking is that we've got other committees of the government talking about AI strategies and cybersecurity related issues. And over the last couple of months, we've seen a lot of concern about the power of AI models like
Mm-hmm.
Claude Mythos, which has been finding weaknesses and vulnerabilities in systems, some of which have been around for decades. So, this notion that you could have the government mandate weakening those safeguards and you could limit it solely to the good guys having the kind of access that government is looking for. I mean, it just doesn't work. I mean, we know that once you start weakening these systems at behest of whomever, the reality is bad guys are going to continue to try to find ways to penetrate that.
Yeah. And all three of you testified at committee. And I watched a lot of the committee hearing for the proceedings. And one of the comments that stood out to me, I mean, I don't even know if I'm able to be shocked at this point, but I was kind of shocked by this. So a lot of police support this. Of course, police support more search powers. But one of the other supporters is Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown. And he said, if you haven't done, he said, if you're worried about your privacy, my response would be don't commit a crime. And I mean, this to me is kind of the mantra of these surveillance totalitarians throughout history. It's this idea of you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Uh, Alexander, what do you think of that line of argument? And what's your response to it?
Well, frankly, I can't believe that he actually put it in those words. I mean, it's a cliche in so many ways. It's also entirely backwards because we like to believe that we live in a society where one is presumed to be innocent. And if that, in keeping with that spirit, by default, we're not going to look into people who haven't aroused our suspicions in some sort of criminal context. And so it's deeply troubling, those comments, and the particularly the cavalier way it's expressed. I think it's I don't I don't want to say too much about what may be motivating that sort of comment, but it's hard to deny that that sort of flippant remark is deeply troubling because we're talking about something as essential as privacy.
Matt, in 20 seconds, anything to add there?
The right to a private life is one of the foundations of a free life, and it's an integral foundation of democracy that this government is eroding.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Mayor Brown is a lawyer, so it's interesting to me that he made a comment like that. We've got to go to break now, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Mark Carney's Bill C-22, which provides new powers for police to conduct digital searches, including the requirement of the retention of metadata, the, depending on who you ask, the creation of backdoors and the ability to break encryption. Professor Geist, how does this legislation compare to police powers or surveillance laws in other countries like the United States or the United Kingdom or allies in places like Australia?
Yeah, I don't think well. I mean, the reality is you can cherry pick data from any different numbers of different jurisdictions to try to make the case that, well, the Canadian law seems reasonable and ignore the fact that we do have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that require compliance. But even if you're taking a look in the main on several of these issues, I mean, I don't think it stands up well. On the encryption side, where we have seen countries try to move forward with this, there have been real consequences. For example, in the UK, they did try to bring in similar kinds of legislation. And Apple said they would withdraw some of their strongest privacy protections as a result, making the same kind of case we were talking about earlier. They just can't comply with the law and provide the level of privacy that they would otherwise expect. On the metadata issue, which is really, I think, just an enormous source of concern, really does create the equivalent of a surveillance map of all Canadians over the course of a year. We see some of our closest allies that don't have this at all. So the United States does not have mandated metadata retention. And in Europe, where we have seen efforts to try to bring that in, the kind of legislation that's being proposed here in Canada has been struck down. It's been found to be disproportionate relative to the privacy concerns that arise as a result.
Now, at committee, Matt, you made a comment that really stood out to me. You said that the metadata retention requirement would would put a tracking device into every Canadian's pocket in the form of their cell phone. Can you elaborate on that and why we might not want that?
Yeah, so this is really extraordinary. There's nothing that any comparable democracy is doing that involves this kind of, well, the minister himself said it was a filing cabinet of Canadian data, just available for police if and when they need it. They are saying they would only go to it with a warrant, but other democracies don't do this. We don't track every citizen just in case it proves useful at some point. And I don't think Canada should be considering being the first to go this far.
I want to get into this kind of broader question of why Canadians should care about this at all. What is the rationale for providing constitutional protection for privacy, Alexander? Why should Canadians care about their privacy?
Well, I think as I alluded to before, Christine, it's hard to conceive of a free society where the private comings and goings of your average citizen are not regarded as sacrosanct. We live our lives with the hope that we will be left alone and be permitted to choose how it is we go about our day-to-day business without the sense that someone is looking over our shoulder, as Matt put it, just in case, we then find ourselves in the midst of some sort of criminal activity. I mean, that's just not how this is supposed to work. If a person is being investigated, there are mechanisms from time immemorial that get to how you should properly investigate when there's really a strong suspicion that something has gone on or is ongoing. But the notion that any Canadian should be, it's very disquieting that there might be a regime in the not so distant future where you and the rest of us on this panel are being monitored, and even data related to this conversation being kept in some mode, in some medium for review, and we wouldn't even know it. It's hard to articulate just how important this is.
Professor Geist, what's your rationale? Like, why should Canadians care about privacy?
Well, I think the fellow panelists have done a great job of highlighting it already. But I would say to people, they should ask themselves: are you comfortable having your salary disclosed to the world, or your information about your sex life disclosed to the world, or frankly, who you visit and where you go and who you meet with? Not that you're doing anything wrong. All of this stuff may be legitimate, and you're not doing anything wrong. But yet, intuitively, we recognize that we have a right for that to remain private. And so, this notion, like Patrick Brown, if you're not doing anything wrong, then what do you have to worry about? Well, is he prepared to provide all of that information publicly?
That's all the time we have. Thank you all so much. We've heard today about Bill C-22, legislation that its supporters say is necessary to combat crime in the digital age. But critics warn it could usher in a new era of government surveillance. How much power should the government have to monitor Canadians' digital lives? And what are we willing to sacrifice for those vague promises of greater security? You be the judge. Thanks for watching Canadian Justice, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.